Welcome to the Sunday Sessions podcast, a ministry of Cuyahoga Valley Church. Sunday Sessions is a weekly exploration of some of the most important topics and ideas in Christianity. Each week, we bring you thought-provoking content designed to equip you to follow Jesus more passionately. No matter where you are in your walk, there's always something new to discover. Whether you're looking to expand your knowledge or be challenged in new ways, this is the place for you. Let's get started.
Thank you guys for being here this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. So just in case you don't know me, I'm Becca. I'm the Director of Community Life and Women's Ministry, and we're going to actually switch away from the microphone. So let me know if you're unable to hear me at any point. So a few announcements before we jump in. Just a reminder, this is the last Sunday that we're going to be looking at our World Religions mini-series. And next week, we're going to be starting a mini-series on church history. So this is going to be the first part of studying Church History 1, as we're calling it. And we're going to go from the early church up through the Reformation, part 1. We're going to split the Reformation in half. And when we do part 2 of the class, we'll also start with the Reformation. So next week, we're launching that mini-series, and Joe Valenti is going to be teaching the first class on the early church. So we'd love to have you there. That's a 4-week series. At the end of that series, we'll take a 1-week break and then do a counseling mini-series all about how to kind of take some counseling principles and good communication skills and bring those into the holiday season when you might be seeing family or friends that you haven't seen in a while. So that counseling mini-series is going to be taught by Dean Siley, Walt Broadbent, and Lauren Meyer. So that's going to be a lot of fun too. But before we get there, we'll get to church history. And today, we're ending our World Religions series. So today's Sunday session class is going to be a little bit different than the ones that we've looked at so far in this mini-series. We've already had quite a bit of variety here, right? We've studied Hinduism and Islam. We've looked at some religions that are totally distinct from Christianity. And then we've looked at a couple of religions that identify themselves as sects of Christianity, right? We've looked at Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And to end our time studying, today we're looking at some topics that are a good bit more nebulous and hard to pin down. Today, rather than talking about one group of people that all claim to be a part of the same religious system, we're going to be looking at some commonly held beliefs that exist within a number of modern religious and philosophical systems. So this is a little bit more philosophy-oriented, particularly in our Western world today. So we're really thinking about the people around us and the types of things they might believe if they don't think of themselves as being religious. As author Glenn Scrivener puts it, he wrote this book, The Air We Breathe. It's a really good book. It's called Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality, How We All Came to Believe in These Things. But he says, he calls it this, and today we're going to be looking at the air we breathe, right? Well, we will be examining some worldviews and beliefs that permeate our culture, that are often accepted by the people around us, that we live with, play with, work with, and that at times we may even find ourselves accepting in part, perhaps without realizing it. Some philosophical beliefs that kind of undergird our society. So today, to do that, we're going to be looking at 2 major topics: secular humanism or secularism. We're going to use those words interchangeably from here on out, and universalism. So secular humanism or secularism does not call itself a religion. It's more of a philosophy stemming from the Renaissance, from the Enlightenment, and from modern democratic Western impulses. But for some people who label themselves either atheist or agnostic, or they just say, I don't really care, many of the beliefs that these people hold at times with kind of a religious conviction come from the broad umbrella of secularist thought. Next, we'll take a brief look at the concept, or the broad concept, of universalism, looking at universalism that's developed from heretical Christianity. And as a side note, when we say something is heretical, we just mean it's not Orthodox Christianity. It's not good Christian belief. We don't mean like, those people are heretics and they're the worst. We just mean they don't believe something that is in line with historic, authentic Christianity. So we're going to look at universalism that's kind of come from heretical Christian beliefs, as well as universalism that's developed under more of a New Age Eastern religious perspective. Sometimes secularism and universalism coexist, sometimes they don't, but we're going to look at where they overlap and where they're generally distinct as ideas and ideologies. So our goal for this morning is not necessarily to nail down every single statement that could be true about people who believe in or are heavily influenced by secularist philosophy or universalistic thought. But what we're trying to do is take some ideas that permeate our culture, that have religious undertones in the way people believe them, and talk about them for the purpose of understanding, okay, number one, how can I best talk about my faith, my trust in Jesus, in a way that will make sense and that will speak clearly to the people around me who seem to have no interest in organized religious thought or have no interest in the kind of religion that we follow. If we walk away from today able to do that even just a little bit better, then we've hit our goal. So some of you may be like me. I know many people who wouldn't call themselves religious, but who might say something to me like, well, I don't know what I believe in, but I'm sure there are many ways to know God. Or you might know someone who says, I don't really trust in religion and faith. Those are really hard to pin down. I trust in science and facts. Both of these people I've just described would be influenced by, number one, universalistic thought, whether or not they know it. And number two, in that second example, secularism. This may sound like someone or some people that you know too. So that's just a really short preview of what we're going to be looking at today. I wanted to spend a little bit of time setting that up because it's so different than what we've been doing. But I believe it's really important when we think about sharing the gospel with the people we actually know today. And so before we dive into the rest of our time together, we're going to take a little bit of time for discussion. So I want you to turn to someone around you, and we're going to talk about those two questions in question time one. The first one says, think about people in your life who seem to reject any type of religion. Pick one or two to focus on in your mind. What are the things that these people value the most? And what do you think influences their decision-making? And number two, why do you think humanity as a whole is often so tempted to come up with or believe in worldviews that exclude the existence of God? So you guys discuss, and we'll come back together in a bit. All right, so we're going to go ahead and kind of come back together. Thank you guys for discussing. And we're going to have a little bit more time at the end of our time together to continue this discussion after we finish looking at content. So some of the things I heard around the room were some of you saying things like, you know, I know someone or some people who say things like, well, I believe in some kind of higher power, but I don't really need to put a label on that. Or, well, I'm really trying to be a good person, and I think that in the end, that's going to be what's most important for me or most beneficial for me. And so as we're going to continue to look at, you know, we've got some people, especially when we think about universalism, that would say, I'm a universalist. But there's some people who would hold universalistic beliefs but wouldn't know what that was called. You know, they would just be like, I don't know, the higher power. And then for people who would kind of fall under secularism, you're probably never going to meet someone who says like, hi, I'm Becca, I'm a secularist. But again, these are just ideas that we kind of see crop up as like, well, I don't know if faith is really reliable. That sounds like kind of hocus pocusy. I'm just going to trust in some other things that seem more solid to me. So we're going to take a look now at some initial stats, and then we're going to kind of move through this. So in the initial stats, you have a quote in your notes that says currently about 3 in 10 U.S. adults, it's 29%, are religious nones. So that's people who describe themselves as atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular when asked about religious identity. Self-identified Christians of all varieties, this is important because you see how broad this is, Protestant, Catholics, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which would be Mormons who would call themselves Christians, but we would not call them Christians because of them not believing in the gospel of Jesus Christ is sufficient for salvation, and Orthodox Christians. So this is a very big umbrella. Make up 63% of the adult population. So that's anyone who did on a Pew Research survey, they said, yes, I'm a Christian. They didn't have to prove what that meant. They just identify as that. So Christians now outnumber religious nones by a ratio of a little more than 2 to 1. In 2007, when the center began asking its current question about religious identity, Christians outnumbered nones by almost 5 to 1. So this category is growing in the U.S. of people who, on an official document, would say, yeah, I don't really believe in anything. Either I haven't thought about it, or I have, and I've decided I don't believe in God, or I don't care if there's a God. And then Pew Research also found that overall, roughly 6 in 10 American adults accept at least one New Age belief. So this, one of the things we'll look at in universalism, we'll look at the pseudo-Christian side of it, and then we'll look at the New Age side of it. Specifically, 4 in 10 American adults believe in psychics and that spiritual energy can be found in physical objects, while a somewhat smaller number shares express belief in reincarnation, and astrology. So self-identified Christians are part of this number. So this is where these things get confusing, because someone could say, yes, I'm a Christian. Yes, I also believe in reincarnation and astrology. So that's something to keep in mind thinking about those numbers. Now, surveys are not perfect, right? But both of these snapshots give a good indication that many people in the U.S. hold agnostic beliefs or identify as nones, and a good number of people in the U.S. also believe in some kind of New Age-related information. And these percentages help nail down a lot of what I kind of said anecdotally in my introduction, right? These beliefs are pervasive, and we probably encounter some version of them in our everyday lives with people who don't necessarily say, universalism is my religion, or I'm a secularist. So to keep moving this morning, we're going to look at the history of secularism and the history of universalism, focusing on recent history over the past hundreds of years. And as usual, this is going to be in really broad strokes. There's a lot more study that could be done here. And to rely on some of this history and belief section, I'm relying on Dean C. Halverson pretty heavily. This is his book, The Compact Guide to World Religions. Isn't this great design? It's just really, really good, really fun. So thanks to Halverson for these broad categories when we think about the history of secularistic philosophy. So broadly speaking, we can trace the rise of secularism by looking at three vast historical periods: the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern age. So the Renaissance, roughly 1400 to 1600, it was a period of time that saw the Western world in particular kind of transitioning from the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, to a new age of thought and progress. Halverson cites the printing press as one reason for this, right? People were becoming more literate. People had more access to the written word for themselves in a way that had never really happened before, because the written word could be spread faster and more cheaply than ever before. And then Halverson also looks at Galileo and the church as one example of the type of thing that was happening during this time in the Renaissance period that spurred humanity in the West toward secularist philosophy, or really philosophy where we're looking at a world and we're not thinking about God or his importance in it as we think about our meaning or our purpose or what is really most important. So to really simplify the story of Galileo, some of his fellow professors in the Roman Catholic Church were in a dispute over whether the sun revolved around the earth or the earth revolved around the sun. The official church leaders at that time believed that the Bible said the sun revolved around the earth. There's lots of different places in scripture where this is pulled from. Some of it was just tradition, but one story that's sometimes cited as the story of the Israelite army making the sun stand still with Joshua. And I think the biblical text, the way it's described, is that like the sun stood still. And so the church was like, oh, if the sun's standing still, it must be standing still from its orbit around us. But there were some other reasons for this too, like the church thinking that if Earth and everything on it was kind of the pinnacle of God's creation, of course it would be at the center. So just some accepted beliefs that now we obviously don't hold as a society. But then Galileo, he had his telescope, he was looking at the sky, he was using some earlier writings from a philosopher named Copernicus, and he was like, you guys were wrong, the Earth revolves around the sun. So the Roman Catholic Church ended up condemning Galileo and his views, and at the time, they actually stated that those beliefs were heretical. So they said, you, as a Roman Catholic Christian, you must believe that the sun is revolving around the earth. And interestingly, they changed that view not until the 1800s. So when they just had to, they were like, okay, we were wrong. Galileo was right. So this rift between official church teaching and scientific thought continued to grow, where we had these two opposing sides, and more conflicts that were kind of similar continued to occur, especially when we think about kind of the universities, academic thought, versus accepted Roman Catholic Church teachings. Side note, Galileo did live from the mid-1500s to the mid-1600s, so he kind of straddled this period. Copernicus wrote earlier, so his writings were more, I guess, entrenched in the Renaissance. But that brings us to the Enlightenment, 1600 to 1800. And Halverson writes that during the Enlightenment, people began to elevate science to the level of being the ultimate test of truth. And today, it's kind of, I think, difficult for us to grasp what a big shift this was. From the time of Constantine, right? We talked about him a couple of weeks. The church had really been, for a lot of people, the arbiter of truth. Like, the church and the state work together. The church tells us what is true. And even for those who were not Christians, this was still kind of true. Religious belief of some kind almost always constituted ultimate belief for people, whether they were Christian or Muslim or held to a folk religion. And so it was a huge shift when society as a whole began to hold up the broad idea of science as the final judge and jury on matters of reality. And today we're living, what's the word I'm looking for? We're kind of living in the results of that, right? So this is what I mean by the air we breathe. Like, we're kind of like, of course society thinks that way. But it used to not be like that. So our societies today, we still kind of see this. And this is a silly example, but oftentimes in Western society, we think of scientists as fair, calculating, searchers and bringers of truth to the masses. And this is a silly example, but it's one my mom and I laugh about sometimes. Like, think about the way that people who work in a science are portrayed in TV shows you watch, right? Okay, so you've got like, we love crime shows, right? So you've got the forensic people revealing truth. You've got people who are teaching fact in universities. And now think about the way that religious people are often portrayed in secular media. I always tell my mom, like, if I'm watching a show that I haven't seen before and a religious person comes on, I'm like, oh no, this is going to be bad, right? They're probably going to be corrupt. At best, they're confused. At worst, they're actively lying to people. And that's a silly example, but I think it like flows from something that's kind of deep in our societal psyche, where we're like, the people who are reliable are the people who bring us facts and truth about science. And religious people, I don't know about them, right? Like, I don't know about that. So this is a silly example, but it's a simple thing that points to something we see everywhere. That our Western society today thinks this way is influenced by the rise of the importance of the scientific method and scientific thought, which arose and kind of solidified in many ways in the Enlightenment period. And then finally, the modern age. So Halverson cites Darwin and his theory of evolution as an important final development in the secularization of Western society. And he says this: the result of Darwinism was that for many, the belief in God became an unnecessary hypothesis. If man was to find solutions for its problems and hope for its future, people must look to themselves, not to God. And so regardless of where you fall in your new age creation or old age, that's not what we're talking about today. But Halverson kind of cites this place where we're getting further and further from the need to use God in an explanation in secular society, right? Like, we don't really need religion. Like, the church has not really been honest with us or hasn't really cared to know how space works. Now we really don't need God if we're wanting to think about the way that everything was kind of came into existence. And this has kind of been a direction our society has been moving in, particularly in the West. So like thinking about the US in particular, but also other places around the world. And as I kind of stated, this is like really broad strokes. We could spend a lot more time here. But these are broad strokes just to kind of help us get in the mindset of understanding, okay, where did we move from and how did we get here? And there are unique ways that I think sharing the gospel, as we're going to talk about, is really accessible in this age that it might not have been, right? In the time when the Roman Catholic Church was dictating belief, and people believed what they were told in that way. We have some unique challenges now, but also some unique opportunities. So now looking at universalism, this is going to be a little bit shorter. Today, when we talk about universalism, we're going to kind of break it up into New Age universalism and pseudo-Christian universalism. So with New Age universalism, when I talk about New Age universalism, it's really a hodgepodge of a lot of different belief systems. One religion that's greatly influenced New Age thought is Hinduism, which we looked at a few weeks ago. Although proponents of universalistic New Ageism often believe a diverse collection of things, only some of them coming from Hindu thought or practice. Buddhism, which as we know from our Hinduism lesson, came originally from Hinduism, also influences many New Age beliefs. And New Age proponents might believe in the power of crystals. Some may believe in alien life and our ability to contact it, and a number of other things. So this is a big umbrella. And then when we think about pseudo-Christian universalism, there are many ways we could thread the needle here, so to speak. Many ways we could tell the story of the development of universalism kind of out of Christianity, particularly in the United States. But one thing to note right at the beginning, which we'll touch on later again in our belief and practice section, is that universalism is never Christianity. Christians believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, that there's one way to know God, a way that he's provided for us through the person and work of Jesus Christ. Through Jesus, we have salvation, and by knowing and walking with Jesus, after coming to know him, we become more like him through the power of the Holy Spirit. So universalists, on the other hand, believe there are many ways to know God. Maybe they see knowing Jesus as one of them, and maybe they don't. But either way, the exclusivity of the gospel is lost in universalism, and so it becomes something other than Christianity. And that's an important distinction. There are many people who say, I believe there are many ways to know God, and they also call themselves a Christian. We would have to say respectfully that they're not correct. You can't be a Christian who doesn't trust in Jesus as the way to know God. To believe otherwise is not correct. And as we'll talk about in evangelism, that doesn't mean we need to be unkind, but we just need to know what are the bounds of Christianity and what falls outside of that. In John 14:6, Jesus himself states, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But universalism, the belief that there are many ways to know God and be saved by him, has cropped up inside Christianity as a heresy for a long time. The ancient Christian heretic Marcion is often cited as an early teacher of universalism, and he lived from AD 65 to 160. So from the beginning, this has been something that's kind of cropped up, and we've had church fathers go, no, we don't believe that, and then it comes back up, and we have to have Christian teachers who say, hey, that's not Christianity anymore. And in the U.S., in Protestantism, this is so broad, but the trend in more liberal denominations of Christianity, especially around and following the Civil War, began to descend into universalism. There's so many reasons for that. But today, there are some churches that call themselves Christian churches that teach universalistic beliefs, which is indeed confusing. There are also entire denominations that came out of Christianity at one time that no longer call themselves Christians, that proclaim themselves as universalists. So one we're going to look at as an example is the Unitarian Universalist denomination. We'll look at them a bit more in a moment when we talk about belief and practice for different kind of universalists, but they're actually a great example because they're organized, they have an association website, and the things they believe are things that a lot of universalists share. But we'll start by looking at belief and practice when it comes to secularism, which, as I've talked about, we're not talking about a religion so much as a philosophy. So this isn't something people hold to in a religious way that they're aware of. They don't admit that to themselves or think of their beliefs that way at all. So I think what happens often when someone adheres to the tenets of secularist philosophy above all else, it ends up being a kind of hedonism. That is, if God doesn't matter or he doesn't exist, or if it just doesn't matter if he exists, then of course he has no say in how I live my life. And so the individual living in this philosophical space might avoid thoughts of God altogether and just live however they would like to. I think we can see this in our society today. Secular culture as a whole is very favorable to the idea of do what's best for you, and what is best for you is whatever you decide it to be. Because if anything can be true, if truth is absolutely relative, then there's no way to impose truth on anyone else. It really does become my truth. What do I think is best? There's no God. There's no reason for me to listen to someone else imposing their beliefs on me. So my desires become paramount. Someone who holds secular humanistic thought at the highest level believes that human desires and beliefs are the most important thing in the universe, and thus they should almost always, not always, but almost always be encouraged and pursued, which is just fascinating, and you can take that in a lot of different directions. Now, when we look at universalism, it's a little bit different, but we'll see at the end of our time together, a lot here is similar. So first, we have what I'm calling New Age Universalism. One of the resources that'll be listed online later and is actually in your handout right now, I think, that I used to build this lesson is an interview published recently on the Gospel Coalition website with a woman who left New Age practice to become a Christian. And she writes this of New Age proponents. New Agers often think there are multiple ways to God. You just have to access your truth, or perhaps you can access Christ consciousness. None of this is true. The truth is there aren't multiple ways to God. There's one. His name is Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one gets to the Father except through him. So she says in this article, which is just really well done, she says, this is actually what people practicing New Age practices need to hear. Because as I mentioned, New Age practice can span a lot of things. We saw that in the Pew Research study. but nothing that is definitive or limited, right? It's like, if that works for you, that's great. If using crystals works for you, that's wonderful. If going to see a tarot card reader works for you, that's fantastic. If trying to access the spirit realm through a guide is what is making you happy, do that. So there's not an objective truth. And this woman in this article says this is what people that believe these things need to hear. They believe there are many ways to know God, or maybe they believe there's no God at all. And the term New Age can encompass a lot, which is one of the difficulties in knowing what someone means when they say, I experiment with some New Age practices. It's hard to know what that actually means. I was recently having a conversation with a friend who, before she became a Christian, dabbled for many years in a variety of New Age spaces. And one of the things she shared from her time in that belief system is that some of the things she did and practiced were nothing, just fancy chants or like weird beliefs with no underpinning. Or maybe she even talked about some kind of pseudo multi-level marketing schemes that were kind of couched in New Age phrasing. But some of the things she was involved in she now believes demonic. She said she saw things she couldn't explain, felt connections she couldn't always understand to forces that seemed like they were beyond her comprehension. And so as a Christian now, she understands those things as a kind of spiritual warfare. So she would say, some of the things I experienced in practicing New Age was nothing, and some of it was something, but not a good something. And so that's also one of the confusing things thinking about this, is that some of it's nothing, and some of it may actually be something that is not spiritually good. And so we need to ask good questions when we're talking to people who do identify in this way. So before we move on, to give just a little more clarity to some common New Age beliefs, the same Pew Research article I quoted earlier, and I mentioned a few of these, mentioned the following: belief in reincarnation, astrology, psychics, and the presence of spiritual energy in physical objects like mountains or trees. And Luke and I were talking earlier about just the idea of karma, right? So we talked about karma in Hinduism, the belief that if I do good things will happen to me. And the belief in karma as a whole crops up so many places around us today, right? You might know Christians that are like, oh, well, I think it's good karma that this happened to me. Or we were talking about the music of the Beatles in the 60s, right? These big cultural figures who kind of lean into Eastern philosophy, but they wouldn't say they're Hindu, maybe, but they would say oh, I really believe in karma, or I don't want bad karma to come my way, so I'm going to donate this money to this cause. And we see this in a lot of different spaces. So beliefs can vary wildly here, but need for a saving relationship with Jesus Christ remains the same. And rejection of Jesus Christ as the way to know God remains the same. And then finally, we're going to look at pseudo-Christian universalism. Earlier, I mentioned the Unitarian Universalist denomination is one group that came from Christianity that has now become not Christian. And they would not, on their official websites, call themselves Christian either. They would say, I think the way they put it, I don't think I quote that. They say we came out of Christianity, but we've now developed a more open belief system to accept anyone, basically. So this is from the Unitarian Universalist Association website, and they state of themselves, our beliefs are diverse and inclusive. We have no shared creed. Our shared covenant supports the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Oh, this is it. Though Unitarianism and Universalism were both liberal Christian traditions, this responsible search has led us to embrace diverse teachings from Eastern and Western religions and philosophies. They go on to say, Unitarian Universalists believe more than one thing. We think for ourselves and reflect together about important questions: the existence of a higher power, life and death, sacred text, prayer, and spiritual practices. And then finally, the last thing I want to read from their website is that under the portion of their website where they answer the question, what do we believe about God? They say this: we have many ways of naming what is sacred. Some of us believe in a God, some don't believe in a God. Some believe in a sacred force at work in the world and call it love or mystery or source of all or spirit of life. We're thousands of individuals of all ages, each influenced by our cultures and life experiences to understand the ground of our being in our own way. We are agnostic, theist, atheist, and everything in between. So that honestly sums it up really well, right? This denomination and some others like it that came out of Christianity at one time have stopped believing in, teaching, or proclaiming that Jesus is the only way to know God. And this is not like a secret either. Like, this is on their association website. This is something that they're really proud to say. Like, we believe that you can believe anything and be a part of what we do here. And when proclamation of the gospel ceases, both internal and external, right, as the church were to preach the gospel to ourselves and each other and the world around us, when that ceases, what we're looking at is no longer Christianity, regardless of the label attached. So that's important to keep in mind. So as I mentioned earlier, when we think about secularistic thought and when we think about different types of universalism, beliefs can vary wildly. We can have lots of different practices or no practice at all, but lostness remains the common denominator. Need for a saving relationship with Jesus and rejection of him is the same. Some similarities we see here are the subjective view, right? I can believe what I want to believe and you can believe what you want to believe, but don't try to force me to adhere or condone your beliefs. So kind of this overwhelming subjectivity. And then another similarity here is that within these paradigms, there's no need for evangelism at all, right? If what I want is most important to me, and if what Luke wants is most important to Luke, other than as like a thought experiment, there's no reason for us to really have to talk about that ever, or share with one another. There's no sense of urgency in talking about religious belief, because if everything is relative, if truth itself is relative, there's just no need to get into difficult conversations about these things. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we think about evangelism. And moving on to think about evangelism a little more deeply, we've discussed today, I've said this a lot because I really want you guys to remember it, that in some ways both secularism and universalism can sometimes be more like and seem more like philosophies or frames of thought than true religions. However, even if and when that's the case, it's important that we as Christians are able to defend against philosophies that fall short of, but can exist in a person's mind in place of gospel truth. You know, we need to be able to talk well to people who believe these things, because I would say probably I encounter more people who fall into one of these categories on a daily basis than people who say I'm Hindu or I'm Muslim, or who say that they adhere to a religion. As C.S. Lewis once stated, good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. And I love that, right? Like he's saying we need as Christians to think about our faith intellectually and winsomely, because there are people who believe things that we don't think are true or good, and we need to be able to provide an answer. And a writer for the Gospel Coalition named Noah Sintel puts it, Christianity is more than philosophy, but it's certainly not less. And I love that picture, right? Because we believe that through Jesus, we can know God, but there are ways we can talk about our faith that have philosophical implications. We need to be prepared. I mean, this could basically be the tagline of this World Religions mini-series. We need to be prepared to speak winsomely about the gospel, about our Christian faith, in a way that takes into consideration what those around us believe. And when it comes to secular humanism or secularism and universalism, this means understanding the gospel in a nuanced way, because we might be talking to someone who doesn't even see what most influences them, right? It's important for us to be able to know that as we talk to them. And it can also mean loving our brothers and sisters well, or really people who could become our brothers and sisters in Christ, who are lost in a landscape of no religion, or of a pseudo-religion built on good deeds, an impersonal universal God who may or may not exist, and no ultimate hope. So to land the plane, I have two final pointers when it comes to sharing the gospel with people who fall under either of these broad categories. Number one, ask good questions. Many times, people who are vaguely agnostic or atheist, they haven't spent a lot of time unpacking the why behind what they believe. In a loving way, ask questions about things like, what do you believe that matters most? Like, what matters most to you? Or even, what's most important to you? Especially if they then give you the opportunity to answer your own question, you have an open door to share the gospel. Kind of like when we were talking about Hinduism, a lot of people who believe in universalist thought or who just kind of exist in a secularistic philosophy, they won't be threatened by you sharing what you believe, right? They might be threatened when you say, hey, I think this is the only true thing. It is important to get there at some point, but just having this conversation may not be a threatening thing to some of them. And then number two, pray. Pray that the Lord will give you wisdom in loving these friends. Oftentimes, people who believe some of these things are running from God and from any type of overt belief in Him, and they may feel an emptiness, but they may not want to share that with you in the first conversation, especially when we think about universalism, both pseudo-Christian universalism and New Age universalism. These people are searching for truth, right? Especially when we think about people practicing some New Age things. They have searched in a lot of places for truth many times. They want to connect with God. They want to know Him. And they probably have not found Him in the things they're doing. So sharing the gospel is a gift for them. And then when we think about people who don't want to believe anything, who are kind of those religious nuns, they're running from God in their own way. It just looks different. But these are people that God has created, that God loves, and that God wants to know Him. And that's really the thing to keep in mind no matter who we're talking to. We share the gospel not to convince someone by beating them over the head with a stick, but we share the gospel because God's created these people, and He really wants them to know Him. So it's not our job to convince, it's just our job to share. So to end our time today, we're actually going to have time for questions with the class, but before we do that, we're going to go to question time number 2. And these are the 2 questions. Number 1, what is something new that you learned today? And number 2, think about your own upbringing and your worldview today. How are you practically tempted to downplay the existence or work of God in ways that affect your Christian faith, if you're a Christian? Because as we kind of briefly talked about today, these are beliefs that are all around us, and that we can sometimes kind of subtly start to believe as well. So we're going to discuss those, and we'll come back together for questions.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Sunday Sessions. We're hopeful that you found this content so important for your spiritual growth that you'll want to learn more. Each week, we provide a PDF handout for notes and additional resources for study on the topic. You can always find these resources in the show notes or by visiting cvconline.org/Sunday Sessions. May the Lord bless you this week, and we hope you'll come back next week for another episode of Sunday Sessions.